In this video, I am going to show you how to attach the binding all around the outside of your quilt. I sew my binding onto the front of my quilt using a sewing machine. I usually start at the bottom edge of my quilt in the centre. So to start with, I will pin my binding at the centre. Raw edges are matching and I've left a little bit of excess fabric just at the beginning before I've put that pin in the centre. I will then come about another 6 to 8 inches and I'll pop in a second pin, and this is where I'm going to start sewing. You want a section of binding unstitched at the start. This will help you join your binding pieces together. I'm going to take my stitch length up to 3.5. That's just because there's a lot of layers to get through as you're stitching this binding onto the quilt. I use this inside edge of my foot here as a guide when I'm stitching my binding into place. If I use that as a guide, I'm stitching my binding at 3/8 of an inch from the edge of the binding. I'm going to sew along to that first corner, just taking it nice and easy. You don't have to rush. Now that I've reached my first corner, I'm going to check that I'm the right distance away from that second side. I want to be 3/8 of an inch away, just like I was from when I was sewing down the first side. Oh, nope, I've gone a wee bit too far, so I'm just going to turn it back round and reverse one stitch and check it again. Okay, there we go, that's better, that's lined up properly now. I'm 3/8 of an inch away from that second side, just the same as I was from the first side. And now we're ready to mitre this first corner. First thing to do is to reverse off of this fabric. And then you want to stitch forward again, just a stitch or two, just enough to catch your fabric and no more. You want it to be secured in position so when you lift your foot, the corner of your quilt doesn't move. I'm going to mark a pink line where my binding just meets the edge of that quilt. And now I want to fold the fabric just at that pink line and fold it up so that pink line is now along my top edge. Just fold your fabric down, make sure it's all nice and neat underneath. You'll feel a little diagonal crease underneath, and then you put your foot back down and carry on sewing along that second side. Your first couple of stitches may be quite tricky because there's a lot of fabric under there. Just take it nice and slow as you start sewing again. And then carry on sewing right down until your next corner. And here we are at the second corner. I am just going to check my distance again to make sure that I am 3/8 of an inch away from that next side. Yes, I'm happy with that. And now we're ready to mitre the second corner, and I'll just run through again how we do that. The first thing to do is to reverse off this corner, and then you come forward again just enough to catch all those fabric layers, just to secure it in place once you lift your foot. I'll put another little pink mark where the binding meets the edge of the quilt. So just put a little crease into your fabric and then fold it under your quilting foot so that that pink line is lying across the top edge. There will be a nice little diagonal fold under here. You'll be able to feel that with your finger. And just tidy up your binding edge, put your quilting foot back down and carry on sewing to the next corner. And just take your time sewing those first couple of stitches. You may find it easier to just turn your sewing machine by hand. Just carry on sewing to that third corner. And then you're going to mitre that third corner, just folding where the little pink line is, just fold it under your foot, get it into position and sew to the next corner. Just fold it again and carry on sewing along that final side. When you get back onto the final side, you don't want to sew right along to the centre of the quilt. You want to stop sewing about 8 inches before you reach that centre point, which is marked with a pin. You need to join your pieces of binding together before you can finish sewing it onto your quilt. I'm going to cut my thread and I'm going to take my quilt out from under the sewing machine for now. Now I'm going to show you how to trim the two edges of your binding to the correct size so that you can sew these together and finish attaching that binding onto the front of your quilt. I'm working along the bottom edge of my quilt and this pin here marks the centre point of the quilt. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'll take this first piece of binding and I'm just going to match the raw edges together and lie it along the edge of the quilt. I'm going to take a pin and I'm going to mark my binding at the centre point of the bottom edge of this quilt. It's easy to see where this is because the centre point is between the purple and the orange fabrics. And then I'm going to do the same with the second side. I'll take a pin and I'll mark the centre point in this piece of binding too. And I'll pop my pin into the binding at that centre point. So that's me marked both pieces of my binding and they both line up in the centre of the quilt. I'm going to trim one of the pieces of binding. I'm going to add a 1/4 inch from where the pin is. And I'll do this using the little 1/4 inch line on my ruler. I'll just line that up with the pin and then I'll cut the fabric using my rotary cutter. And then I'm going to do the same for the other piece of binding too. I'll lie that down flat. I'll pop my ruler on top, line my 1/4 inch mark on my ruler along the pin and trim that excess fabric off. So now you've trimmed both sides of your binding. Both have an extra 1/4 inch of fabric on each side. You're going to remove those pins, unfold your pieces of binding and you're going to match those up right sides together and then sew these pieces of binding together at a 1/4 inch. Just remember to return to a regular stitch length when you're sewing these two pieces of binding together. Now this is why you've left the excess fabric. It makes it easier to manoeuvre your binding and get it back under your sewing machine. You can use those couple of pins just to secure it so it doesn't move. So you can see here that I've sewn my binding together using a 1/4 inch seam and I'm going to remove those pins. I'm going to finger press those seams open. I'm going to fold my binding back over and then I'm going to match that join to the centre of my quilt and pin it into place. And now I'm ready to finish stitching down this binding from here all the way along to here. Now remember to take your stitch length back up again to 3.5. And that's me, I've stitched my binding down. I can take this pin out. The next thing to do is to snip all 4 corners of your quilt. You just want to snip off a little triangle. You want to reduce the bulk in these corners before you fold your binding over and attach it at the back. And I'll just take a little triangle off this corner too, and I'll do the same with my remaining 2 corners. And once you've snipped all 4 corners, we're going to flip the quilt over and we are ready to clip the binding to the back of the quilt. And I'm going to start in the middle again because that's just normally where I start when I'm attaching binding or clipping it down. I'm going to use some of these wonder clips. These are really great for clipping and securing your binding until you're ready to hand stitch it into place. So you just fold your binding over. You're just folding it over so it just comes just beyond your stitched line. There are a lot of frayed edges on this fabric. I just tuck them in before I fold over my binding and clip it into place. Another wee clip on there. And I'm going to carry on clipping in this way until I reach my first corner. Once I reach that corner, I just flip my quilt round 90 degrees. I fold over my binding and clip it into place just to secure that binding into place before I miter my corner. And again, you're just folding it over so that your binding fabric just comes beyond that stitched line. and keep clipping until you're almost back to the corner. And to mitre your corner at this side of your quilt, you fold over your binding on the second side of the quilt, and you'll see that you have a little diagonal fold on your binding fabric. Hold it in place, and then you fold the first side back down on top of it. Now, to secure my corners in place, I like to use a pin. I just feel that that holds my corners more securely in place than the wonder clips do. And then I carry on clipping my quilt together until I reach the next corner. And we're almost at that next corner, and I'll show you how to mitre again. You're folding this top edge down first, and then you fold the second side down on top of it, and you'll have a nice little crease of fabric coming diagonally down from the corner. Both pieces of binding fabric just meet nicely at the bottom corner. And again, I'll use a pin to secure that corner in place. So just to recap, I folded this edge down, then I folded this edge on top of it, and I've got my nice little diagonal fold of fabric just meeting here at the corner, and I've secured that in place with a pin. Now I'm going to carry on clipping all four sides of the binding down onto my quilt and securing each of the other corners with a pin. So here we are. The binding has been clipped down into place around all four sides of my quilt, and I've secured all four corners with a pin. And now I'm ready to hand stitch the binding into place. I'm going to use the same thread as I used for my quilting, which is my black Gutermann thread. I've threaded my needle with some of this thread, I've knotted the end, and I'm ready to start hand stitching. I'm going to fold back my binding, and I'm going to insert the needle just above this stitch line, and I'm going to come back out just under it to secure my thread into place before I start hand stitching. You're going to insert the needle into the binding fabric only, and just take maybe about 1/8 of an inch and bring your needle back out. And then you're going to go into the quilt just where you come out of the binding, same place, but this time you're going into the quilt. And again, just take about the same stitch length, go all the way down through into your wadding, but make sure you don't come out the front because you don't want your hand stitching shown at the front of your quilt. And where you come out of the quilt, you go back into the binding, take about another 1/8 of an inch stitch length. And when you come to these clips, just remove them, take them out the way, and carry on stitching. This stitch is called ladder stitch, so if you're looking for other tutorials online, you know what to look for. You carry on hand stitching your binding onto the back of your quilt in this way until you reach your first corner. Just keep a finger at the back of your hand stitching, and that way you'll be able to tell if your needle comes right through. You really don't want to see any stitches on the front of your quilt. So I have stitched all the way along to my first corner, and I'm ready to secure that corner into place. So I'm going to take that pin out the way. I'm going to put a couple of stitches here and at the corner. I'm going to put my needle down through my backing fabric right into my wadding and come back up through that corner of the binding. Make sure that you catch both sides of the binding when you bring that needle back up through. And just do a couple of stitches in the corner in the same way, and that will secure your corner into place. I've now put about 3 or 4 stitches here into my corner, and as you can see, I've got my nice little diagonal fold on this side and on the other side too. It's difficult to see in the black fabric, but you can see the diagonal fold on both sides. And now you carry on hand stitching that binding into place, making sure you secure all your corners until you've worked your way around all 4 sides. Thanks for watching.